This video is going to introduce you to the FRQ type that we call quantitative analysis, or QAQ for short. As the name suggests, you're going to be analyzing quantities or analyzing data that's related to government. This FRQ is broken down into either 3 or 4 parts. It doesn't really change it whether it's 3 or 4 parts, but sometimes they take the middle part and instead of putting it all together in one, they break it into 2 parts. So you'll either have a A, B, and C, or an A, B, C, and D. Part A is perhaps the easiest thing on the entire exam, so we really don't want to screw this part up. In Part A, you are simply asked to describe data presented in the data table or chart or graph or whatever it is that you're looking at. Literally, just describe the data. Because it's so easy, make sure you read it carefully. Look at the title of the data table, look at the key, look at what it's measuring, look at the data carefully. And I also encourage you to keep this answer simple. Some students try to get too creative, sometimes I'll say too cute. They try to look at some very minute detail or nuance or deviation in the data, instead of just looking at the main point it's trying to express. Depending on when in the school year you're watching this, you'll know that in some units, particularly in Unit 2, we look at a lot of charts and graphs and data tables in class. Now, part of it is because the content in that unit lends itself to charts and graphs, but it's also because I want to help you to develop the skills of reading these charts, graphs, data tables, so that you can do well in this type of FRQ. So remember, in Part A, you're simply describing the data presented, and you want to keep that pretty simple. Now, Part B is where you do a lot more, and it could be broken into 2 parts. So Part B could become Part B and C. You're asked to do 2 things. First, you're going to describe a pattern or a trend or a similarity or difference in the data presented. Now, you'll see some of these charts, graphs, and data tables have a lot of information in them. So while there might be one main idea or a couple main ideas, when you start to compare the data in them, you can start to see similarities and differences and other patterns and trends. So the first thing you'll do is describe that. Then the second thing they want you to do is to draw a conclusion based on that data. When we talk about a conclusion, what they're basically saying is, we're presenting you with some data that we expect you to kind of understand. You're going to either be able to explain what would cause this result, like why this data would be the way it is, or they're going to want you to talk about maybe an effect of that. Because this is the data, because this is what it's telling me, it could have this effect. Now, notice here on the slide, it says that this conclusion, which can be a cause or an effect, so think about those terms, what causes this or what might be the effect of this. You want to make sure that that conclusion is politically relevant, okay? In other words, relate it to something you've learned in government. Don't make up some bizarre hypothetical cause or effect, perhaps the data is that way because aliens came down and forced people to do this. Keep it politically relevant. Show, in this part, you're showing that you know something about government. Maybe it's not explicit in the data, but you're connecting the data to other big ideas that you've learned, okay? I want to go back one quick thing here. When it talks about in the first part of Part B, describing a pattern, trend, similarity, or difference. Again, think big picture. I mentioned this in Part A as well. Don't overanalyze the data. Don't look at a part of it. If the data is showing you something over a period of time, a 50-year stretch, don't focus on 1 year of those 50 years. A trend or a pattern says, look at the whole of the period. Look at all of this. What do you generally see is going on here? What does the data generally tell us? There's always anomalies. There's always exceptions or fluctuations in data, but we're always looking for kind of the big picture, the big idea. All right, that'll take us to what is either going to be part C, or if part B was broken into two, this will be part D. But in part C, you're now going to be asked to explain how the data in the chart or graph demonstrate a political principle, institution, process, policy, or behavior. Don't let all those words bother you. Basically, what they're going to say is you're connecting this data to something else in government, something else you've learned. Now explain how it shows that. All right. I am going to give you an example here in a minute. So if you're like, none of this makes sense, you keep using all these same words, and I can't even imagine what this would look like. Well, we'll be giving you an example here in a minute, and it'll make a little more sense. But I just wanted to walk you through it first, how they're all structured. So it's in part C that you're going to show your knowledge of government, show all that you've learned. Again, something that's not necessarily given to you in this chart or graph, but you're going to connect it to something else you've learned and then explain how it shows that, okay? That is probably the point that students will struggle with the most, because you have to not just show knowledge of government, but be able to explain government, how it works, or why things are the way they are, okay? This will probably be the part you'll write the most. Here you'll write several, maybe 3, 4, 5, 6 sentences, especially if they're short sentences, to really earn this point. Last thing here, the QAQ earns 4 points, not 3, like you'll see in 2 of the other types. And then the argument essay type that I'll introduce you to last actually has 6 points to it. But don't sweat these points. Whether it's 3, 4, or 6, remember all 4 FRQs are weighted the same. They're all equally important. And actually, I think it's better when they're worth more points. If you think about it this way, when an FRQ is out of 3, each point is 1/3 of the score, or remember, 12.5%. Each FRQ is 12.5% of your exam score. So that means each individual point in an FRQ is like 4% of your exam. Kind of puts a little pressure on each point. This one's out of 4, so you can afford to maybe miss one of the 4 points and still be okay. It's worth a little less. And then in that argument essay, with it being out of 6, it takes a little pressure again off each one. So this one's worth 4. Part A is worth 1. Part B, if it's combined, is 2. If it's broken up, then each B and C will be worth 1. And then part C, or D, if it was broken up, will be 1. So it's 1, 2, 1. All right, let's take a look at an example. Now, this is drawing on your knowledge of Unit 1 material. I thought I would use a Unit 1 QAQ. There aren't a lot of these that I have. I could make a lot more from Unit 2 material and some of the later units, but I thought this might be good as both a review, and if you're watching this video very early in the year, you'll be able to relate to this better. So you'll see here in the upper right-hand corner, this is the data table or chart, graph. We would want to look very carefully at what it's measuring. It is measuring the number of both federal government employees and state and local. Now, state and local are combined together in this graph. Federal is separate. And it's over a period of time. When you look at the key at the bottom, you see which line is which, so you don't want to brush past that. There's a big difference between these lines, and you want to recognize that difference. And of course, we're measuring the number of employees in the millions, so these are really big numbers here. Now, what I did is this particular sample QAQ, part of it is similar to one that the College Board has created. So this isn't exactly one that they've used on the exam, but it's pretty close. I actually modified it a bit because I wanted to show you different ways these questions can be structured. So this will be a good introduction to this, but when you actually get one, it might be a little simpler than this. But part A, remember, part A is always just describe the data. Tell us something in the data. It could actually be as simple as identify the number of federal employees in the year 1970. Okay, here you would have to find 1970, find the line for federal employees. You'd have to be pretty close. You could ballpark it. It's probably why they wouldn't ask you that in this question, because it's a little harder to read the lines. But if we were, instead of given a graph, if we were given a chart and it just said year by year, the number of employees, federal and state, you could easily pick that out of the chart. So part A is often just a very simple, read the data, show us you know how to read a chart or graph, a data table, and answer it. Here, part A says, describe the general trend in federal government employment between 45 and 2000. Now, general trend means don't describe the nuances of the line. Don't write something, and I get this a lot. Well, in 1945, it was around 3 million. Then it dropped slowly, and then it kind of steadily went up. And then it looked like it went up a little more in the late 60s, and then it flattened out for a while. And then it slightly went down in the 90s. That is not a general trend. A general trend is a snapshot of the whole. So look where the number of federal employees were in 1945. They were around 3 million. Look where they were in 2000 or approaching 2000, about 3 million. And the line is pretty flat. So we're going to give you sample responses here in a minute, but we would say, well, the general trend in federal employment is pretty steady, steadily around 3 million, doesn't increase or decrease very much, okay? Big picture general trends. Don't overcomplicate this. Now in B, you're being asked to compare the two lines. Describe the difference between the trends in federal employment and state and local employment. So now you have to look at state and local employment and say, okay, well, that number had steadily increased. The trend amongst with state and local government employees has been a steady increase. But I'm comparing that to the federal line, which has been stable. So I might say something like, for most of this period, the number of state and local employees was greater than the federal. Or while the number of state and local employees steadily increased over this period, the federal number remained stable. There's a lot of different ways to word it, but you're just basically comparing the lines. Now notice that the state and local line seems to drop a little bit late in the 90s. I'm ignoring that. First of all, I'm not being asked anything specifically about that. And that is not part of the general trend. That's what I mean by sometimes students focus in too much on a small part of the data instead of looking at the big picture, okay? Yes, it dropped off a little bit there in the 90s, but that doesn't change the overall narrative. That state and local employment was steadily increasing over these 55 years, and then it's higher than federal employment for all of it. All right, part C connects back to B. So again, this is where I said it could all be lumped together as B, or it's separated. And I think sometimes they separate it simply because it would get very wordy to put this all in B. But now they want you to draw a conclusion about that difference. In other words, explain what might have caused this change. Because notice back in the 40s, the numbers are about equal. But then from there, we see a big change. What might have caused that to happen? Or what could be an effect of that change? Okay, so now you're going to have to draw on your knowledge and think a little bit and connect other ideas of government. It's possible that, again, if you're watching this early in the year, you might not feel confident saying something about a conclusion. You might be like, well, I don't know what effect that would have. And maybe by the end of the year, you would, as we learn more about government and how it works. I will never give you in class an FRQ that you can't answer. Or if there's a part that I feel like, you haven't learned that yet, I might make it a bonus. But by the end of the year, you'll be able to handle all of this. But you got to think. You got to think about what you know. And then finally, the last part wants you to connect this to some other idea in government that's not explicit in the data. So here, part D, they're assuming that you know something about block grants and or federal mandates. I hope you see the word or, capital there. You're not going to do both. You're going to choose one and make a decision. Which of these do I understand better? But it says explain how either block grants or federal mandates contributed to this difference. So either one of those works. I could make an argument that the changes in these trends, the changes in these lines are a result of block grants or they're a result of federal mandates. I decide which one I know better, and then I explain that. Now let me pause before I show you some sample responses. Let me pause and remind you about one of the general tips about writing FRQs. Remember, I said it's very important that you read the whole question before you begin to respond. And this one seems to prove why. It's possible that you might have, in part C, drawn a conclusion about this difference where you started to talk about block grants or federal mandates. You might say the reason that the state and local line has gone up so high is because of block grants, okay? But if you did that in C, you can't do it again in D, okay? You're never gonna say the same thing twice in an FRQ. There's only 4 FRQs for them to get a sense of your knowledge of government. If you're repeating yourself in them, you're not earning points. So if you saw D already, if you read D already, you might say, oh, okay, I'm gonna talk about block grants or federal mandates in D. I'm not gonna talk about them in C. Maybe in C, I'll focus on an effect of this difference, whereas block grants or mandates might be a cause, all right? So read it all. If you ever find yourself writing in an FRQ, like I said earlier, you're probably not getting that point. All right, so let's look at sample response here. So for part A, again, complete sentence, but a simple idea. They wanted me to describe a general trend in federal government employment. So I have to make sure I'm looking at the right line. That was that line that was lower and very stable. And I'm simply saying federal government employment was rather stable between 1945 and 20. Now, I could describe it a little bit more. So I add another sentence. The number of federal employees was consistently around 3 million. Okay, I probably get the point with that first sentence. Second sentence doesn't hurt. But notice I didn't get into the ups and downs in the line or say that, well, it was maybe closer to 2 million in 1947 and maybe a little closer to 4 million in the late 80s. No, just main idea. This should be a gimme point. Part B, describe the difference between the trends in federal employment and state and local. So I write between 1945 and 2000, the number of state and local government employees steadily and significantly increased. And then I describe that a little more, from about 3 million to about 50 million, while the federal government employment remains stable at 3 million. So I'm comparing the two lines. I'm comparing the trend in the two lines. So the big picture, I'm not comparing any particular year. And my general observation is one line steadily increased, the other remains stable. All right. So every once in a while, I'll get a student who will say, before 1945, both federal and state and local employment was the same at about 3 million. That doesn't explain the difference in the trends. That is comparing a point on the graph. Like saying in 1990, federal, state and local employment was much higher than federal. That's not comparing the trend. That's comparing a particular data point on the graph. We don't want to do that. Big picture trends. Okay, part C, draw a conclusion about that difference. So I put here the difference that I wrote in part B for reference. I'm not rewriting it, I'm just putting it there so you can see it. But in part C, now I need to explain either a cause or effect of this. So here I use a cause. The steady increase in state and local government employees could have been caused by the devolution revolution, as America embraced a new federalism returning, and notice I'm defining what new federalism is. I'm defining what devolution revolution is. It's returning the administration of federal programs to state and local government. We're keeping these federal programs like Social Security, but we're going to put the implementation of them in the hands of the state and local governments. This would have caused those governments, state and local, to have to hire more employees to carry them out. Why is that line growing? Because as we turn to a new federalism, we put more of the work of federal programs in the hands of the state and local governments. They had to hire more people. Here's more of an effect conclusion. So just showing you two different ways you can do this. You would just do one of them, but this is more of an effect. The steady increase in state and local government employees could have had the effect of really straining state and local budgets. Because these employees would be paid, state and local governments may have had to raise taxes or borrow money to be able to afford them in their budgets. Okay? Now note, I could have said something about federal employment as well. This wouldn't put as much of a strain on the federal budget because it's been stable. But either way is fine. And then finally, we get to part D. Now remember, anytime you got to explain, you're probably going to write a little more. Explain how either block grants or federal mandates contributed to this difference. I went with federal mandates, but note well what I did here. I start out by defining federal mandates. I'm not going to jump into an explanation right away. I've got to show the reader I know what federal mandates are. Federal mandates are federal laws or court orders that require states and local governments to do something. It's the federal government telling the states, you got to do this. Always helps to give an example. For example, when Congress passed the ADA, the law included several mandates, like making buildings handicap accessible, that state and local governments had to follow to be compliant. So I've chosen federal mandates of the two. I've defined it. I've given an example. All of that sets me up nicely for now explaining how that would explain the graph. State and local governments often have to hire more employees to carry out federal mandates. An increasing number of federal mandates between 45 and 2000 likely explains the increasing number of state and local employees over that same period. Okay? That's the key point. And hopefully with that, you have a better understanding of how to write the quantitative analysis FRQ.